You can do this as expats. Don't let things hold you back. Don't believe the news and just find the way that works for you. Like, I think we're very much the same sort of mindset on all this sort of stuff, aren't we?
Yeah, for sure. I think you sort of the most common misconceptions, right, about property is the fact
Yeah.
that it's so difficult and you can't do it
Mm.
without heaps and heaps of knowledge, but you can do it. It does
Mm.
take time and it does take learning, but you can do it, right? You know, you are doing it from where today?
Today, right now, we're in Kazakhstan. We've literally just arrived in Kazakhstan on the very comfortable overnight train, actually.
Was it comfortable? What sort of, beds or sort of chairs? What was the setup?
Beds, kind of like full length
Oh,
beds. Like sometimes when we get the cabins, like the beds can be made for people of a certain height. But this was the train was amazing. We had a cabin for the four of us. We all fit in, and it was like bunk bed sort of style. But the beds were full length. Like, I mean, I'm not the tallest in our family, but even my husband and my kids, they had like ample leg room. So yeah, we were very well rested.
very nice. Yeah, I did a sleeper train once in India from Delhi to Goa, which was I want to say 20 hour train journey. And I went in it was when I was backpacking, so I was doing it as cheap as possible. And I went in the sort of bottom sleeper carriage, and
Mhm.
it was a bit of an experience. It sounds like your journey was much more comfortable. But
Yeah.
okay, so how did you end up in Kazakhstan? You know, at the moment, I was just sort of saying in the intro, I think it's a great conversation to have this one, and I've been looking forward to having it because you are living proof that you can do property from anywhere in the world and you can create an income and then go and enjoy yourself, not just the holidays, but potentially do what you're doing, which is the full-time digital, or not digital, full-time nomad thing. So maybe you could just sort of give us a bit of background on what you're doing, and then we can go rewind back to when you became an expat and pick up the journey
Yeah.
and go from there.
Okay, so we tend to slow travel. Well, we travel full time, but we tend to slow travel. So usually we spend 2 to 3 months in a place or the length of a visa because we just find that's conducive with, getting a routine going, just kind of like, getting to know an area, getting a community, and just kind of like having a nice sort of life, really, keeping the business sort of like, keeping the business and the girls learning on the go. But one of my kids last year, she sort of just really wanted to come to Central Asia and the Silk Road. And in her words, she was lobbying for it. And we were like, well, why not? Why not do a stint in Central Asia and like going through the Silk Road sort of countries? She loves like collecting different currencies and seeing how different countries work. So we thought we'd spend a period of time doing faster travel than usual and come to this part of the world. So the weather's best in this sort of area because you can get a lot of snow in Central Asia, kind of like May to September. So we've just been in on the Silk Road in Central Asia since May this year. We started in Uzbekistan. We've been to Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. We've been to Kazakhstan once before, like earlier in the summer when we were waiting a visa for one place, and now we're back in Kazakhstan. Because the kids have organised a couple of meetups with other travelling families. So we're sort of doing those here before we head off back to Southeast Asia when the weather here is getting colder, and we're going to go back to Southeast Asia for the better weather for the winter.
Very nice. And then what's the sort of plan going forward? Because I remember when we first spoke on call a couple of weeks ago, it was sort of when you hear people talking about travels and holidays, you sort of think, okay, well, we're going to go back home, but your plan is to just obviously continue traveling. So what are you sort of looking at doing next?
Yeah, so we're going to a little fishing village in Thailand for a few months. Kind of like the length of the visa there. As a family, we've all got different projects, going on. So it'll be good just to be in one place for a few sort of months to focus on those. So the Thai visa, I think it changes. Is it 4 weeks or 6 weeks? But anyway, we'll be there for around about 6 weeks, and then we're gonna head then on to Malaysia for a few months. So we'll probably be in Malaysia for Christmas. It feels strange to have like that period of time planned out because we often don't know where we're going to be. But just because we've been doing so much, fast travel for us recently, we just sort of thought we'd plan the last sort of quarter of the year being in a few sort of bases. So yeah, just kind of focusing on projects and being in places where we've been to before. I mean, we don't always go to new places. Sometimes it is good to go back to places where you've been before and pick up routines and habits that you've got there and just, slip back into that sort of life.
Yeah, nice. And Malaysia for Christmas is very nice. I always enjoy doing Christmas in Malaysia because it sort of just feels really quiet.
Yeah.
Most of the expats have gone back home and it sort of feels like you've got the place to yourself, which obviously you haven't. But okay, so that I think that sort of sets the tone quite well for sort of what you're doing. And I guess people listening will sort of be thinking, well, okay, how have you got yourself to that stage? And they probably put two and two together because it's a property podcast. So we'll the big surprise you're doing it with through property. But why don't we sort of go, because I think a lot of learnings when it comes to property come from just listening and speaking to other people, right? Which is sort of the thinking behind this podcast. So let's go back to, was it 2009 or when you first became an expat in
Yeah.
Abu Dhabi? Let's go back to there and talk about when you started your property journey and then sort of, the stop starting and then how it got to
Yeah.
where you are now.
Okay, so 2009 was one of those years. You have those kind of like crazy years. In 2009, me and my husband were living in London. It was the year when we got married. We were both working in corporate, like in contract roles in London. We don't have to go back over what was happening in 2009. The year was going a bit, the world was going a bit nuts, shall we say, wasn't it, with the
Yeah.
financial crisis. And we sort of recognised that, working as contractors, as situations were changing, we were sort of like on 1 month notice periods. So I wasn't loving my corporate sort of world, should we say, and my husband, really was. So we decided to move internationally with his work, and we did a global job search, as you do when you're newly married. Like, where should we go in the world? And we looked at various places. It was all quite good fun, and loads of jobs in his industry were in the Middle East. So we kind of like spontaneously went over there. He had a few job interviews, he got offered a job, and a month later we kind of like flew out and started our new life in the Middle East, in Abu Dhabi. And around about that sort of time, I hadn't been happy in corporate, and I'd been looking for something. Like, I kind of like knew I just wanted to have my own business, like something that I could run, that I could run from anywhere really, and not be tied to one location. And having tried a few different things, it was like 2008-9 that I came across property. And we bought a couple of houses then, just before we moved overseas. So the grand idea was I would step out of corporate, and my husband, we'd move overseas with my husband work, and I'd kind of like repeat and grow our property portfolio. I remember thinking, how hard can it be? We bought a couple of houses now, surely it's
Yeah.
straightforward. And those words still to this day ring in my mind, really. And over the next year, I actually took a job in the Middle East to kind of like, just deposit build, basically. But we did another couple of
Yeah.
purchases. I made a few mistakes, and I just kind of let those mistakes define me, really. So by the end of 2010, 2011, I was just like, this isn't working out. I'm just finding it wasn't working out. I'd tried a couple of ways. I'd flown back to and from the UK for one deal, and I felt like I wasn't living anywhere. And I worked with a sourcing agent, and
Yeah.
that just didn't work out for me. So I basically paused growing our portfolio with my head in my hands. And for the next 7 years, basically, if anyone ever mentioned property, as they do in expat environments, like it's a regular conversation on the beach, lots of people are saying, oh yeah, I'm going to, buy a house, I'm going to invest in UK property. I just wouldn't contribute to the conversation. I'd go, oh, right, okay. Oh, weather's nice today. Oh, should we head to
Shell
the...
shocked.
Yeah, I'd just like
Yeah.
divert the conversation in a different direction. I'd go, do not engage. I felt that bad about it all, really. And then 2000, and I took but the whole freedom thing and being able to work from anywhere was important to me, right? I was a training spouse, and I didn't want my work to be tied to our location. I was very aware that with my husband's expat job, he could end up needing to move somewhere at quite short notice, and I wanted to be able to go with that, especially like as we welcomed children into our family. So I had an online job kind of like linked to my corporate background, which was like process management and process design with a management consulting company. And then 2009, we got that call that every expat dreads, really, that kind of like middle of the night family call that says somebody's ill in the UK, like come quick. And that just sort of started to change things, really. And in those moments, you just sort of like reprioritize everything, right? And my husband was flying to and from the UK all the time. He was tired when he was back, and kind of, I'm not saying that from a childcare perspective, I used to work sometimes in the evenings while he then wasn't around, so I reduced my work hours, my even though I work from home, and obviously my income reduced. And suddenly it was like, hang on a minute, what's paying me is these houses that I made a mistake on, right? Yet when life's turned to
Yeah.
chaos, that's what's carried on paying us. So really, shouldn't we be focusing on that rather than, doing some other sort of work, which when life turns upside down stops paying you. So when that hiatus kind of like calmed down and, life got calmer again, I sort of refocused, resigned and exited the part-time job and just put my efforts and energy into our property business, and kind of like had this idea that, I need to make this work. I'm a stay-at-home mum, my children are young, so I need to find a way to make it work whereby I don't have to fly back to the UK, because that just wouldn't work. My husband was flying all over the place to Saudi and Kuwait and Qatar at the drop of a hat, so I couldn't be like, keep my weekend free when I've got to go to the, like, that just wasn't a fly.
Yeah.
So my kind of like my rules were, I have to make this work without flying back to the UK and without my phone ringing, because the kids were little. I don't know if when you've got like 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and the phone rings, they just jump up and down in front of you. I was like, I can't be having to answer the phone or make phone calls. So they were like my two constraints. I've got to
Yeah.
make this work without flying back to the UK, without my phone ringing. And I kind of like, just thought, we've put man on the moon, for heaven's sake. This has got to be possible. Like, let's just change our thinking around that. So yeah, that was when it restarted after 7 years, back in 2017.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of you, I guess you reach the conclusion through your own experience that, which is, I think, a couple of key points for being an expat is, you don't want your phone ringing in the middle of the night. It needs to be low hassle, hands
Mm-hmm.
off, hands free, and you can't be flying back. I mean, from the Middle East, maybe you can fly back for a weekend, but you don't want to do it very often. But if you're
Mm.
living in Singapore or Tokyo, then you physically can't. I was going to say then, I listened to a podcast. Apparently, we didn't put a man on the moon. Apparently, it was a conspiracy theory.
A rocket still went into space. I think as humans we do so many things, and I think it's easy to tell ourselves that things can't be done, and then you go down a spiral of, it can't be done, I'm going to wait till I'm back in the UK and all this sort of stuff. And I just sometimes like to attach myself to big thoughts. Well, if that's possible, then flipping it, we've got to be able to find a way to do this without flying back to the UK, because that's pretty small in comparison to so many amazing things that as a human race we've invented and done.
But for sure, and it's like anything, isn't it? If you want to do it enough, you will find a way.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time it's just finding simple excuses because they make you feel better about the fact that you haven't actually done anything to progress you to whatever it is you're trying to do. And it's easier to fall back into that comfort of saying, oh, well, I can't do that because I don't know where to start or because I've got to be back in the UK. But you're right, when the sort of pain of wanting to do it becomes enough, then you find a way. If we can just go back to your earlier property experiences, I guess two questions. You said you bought some stuff before you left the UK and then you bought some stuff when you were an expat. Did you change what you were buying at all? Did the fact that you were overseas change the properties you bought, or did you pursue the same sort of strategy as when you were buying in the UK?
I pursued the same sort of strategy. I did look at different things for different reasons. I stayed with sort of similar things, and for different reasons, kind of like some of the different sort of stuff that I looked at, it just wasn't the right time for me to do. So I tend to prefer family homes. Tend to prefer two to three bedroom, homes that will be somebody's home for a lifetime. That's what I was looking at back then. We still do some of that now, as well as some different things since the 7-year pause.
As well, you say you sort of learned some lessons and did some things wrong. I think often you can learn the most from people or a lot from people by sort of things that went bad or didn't go according to plan. So what sort of, if you don't mind me asking, what were the lessons you learned from the things going wrong and what went wrong?
Things are not always going to go wrong in life, but quite often things aren't going to go according to plan. And I think that sometimes we can think things not going to plan is a reason for us to stop. Whereas it's not. It's a reason. It's something for us to learn from and carry on. Like, since having kids, a lot of my analogies are kind of like about kids. But like, if a kid falls over, they're not going to say, "Well, I'm going to stop walking." That's it. Like, you just constantly keep trying to help them get
Yeah.
up and go again. And I just look back at me and I was like, "Oh, that's what happened. I fell over once and didn't get up again for 7 years. Like, how ridiculous." So what went wrong? I worked with a sourcing agent. I kind of like bought into the no, actually, the first time, the first purchase I did, I flew to and from the UK for, and it was just, I felt like I wasn't living anywhere. I felt like I wasn't fully like living in the UAE. Yet I wasn't fully living in the UK because I was backwards and forwards. Like, so you had like a week getting over the time difference, and then like a week of normal life, and then a couple of weeks later to be going back, and it just I did it and I was like, yeah, I just don't really like this. It just doesn't feel good, and it certainly doesn't feel scalable. Like you're going to be growing a portfolio. This isn't something I want to be doing regularly. Um, so that sort of like led me into working with a sourcing agent, and I the working with sourcing agents is brilliant. Some of my clients who I work with, from a mentoring perspective, they work with sourcing agents because it's absolutely the right thing for them to do for their like property machine. It works. But for me, I think I always felt like it wasn't the right solution for me, but I felt like I had to do it because it was the only next way. They suggested a few properties for us, which we were keen to go for, and for different reasons, they all fell through. You'd accept the offer, you'd say yes, let's go ahead with this, and then a few months in, it would just fall apart for vendor reasons, different reasons.
Yeah.
And that happened a couple of times. So I was very aware that my sourcing agent was doing a lot of work for me, but, that there wasn't a deal coming through, and they weren't getting paid. So then when a transaction came through, which wasn't an exact fit, I kind of went for it. And on reflection, it was actually probably one that I wasn't exactly looking for, but I was feeling bad for them, right? That they were working so hard for me, and it wasn't working out. So
Yeah.
then we accepted that purchase, and it just became quite complicated. It was actually three properties in one building, and it just got messy. And ultimately, it took quite a few years for me to end up owning all the building.
It was flats in a house, or what was it?
Yeah, it was a house split, so there was lots of things that came out of the bag about the leasehold and the splitting of the building and stuff like that. It just got messy. I learnt a lot from that. It didn't go according to plan. It took me a long time to sort of sort it out, and it wasn't necessarily that it was a sourcing agent, but it comes back to this whole I'd made some wrong choices. I'd ultimately said yes to a deal, which wasn't exactly something that I was looking for because I felt bad. So yeah, it all sort of led into why I kind of paused really. Ultimately though, that purchase turned around, and it ended up, it always ended up being profitable, but I just felt like there was some wrong decisions that I'd made, which I was just looking at things from a perspective of I've made mistakes, rather than looking at it from a perspective of, well, I've learned a lot here, I know what to do differently next time. And it just took me a long time to change my thinking around it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think maybe that, I guess, just sort of thinking then as you were talking, maybe it highlights the fact that, you've got to buy based on your goals and what's right for you, right? Because as soon as you start buying something that isn't quite right for you, then it's not going to be quite right for you. And you're always going to have that feeling of, oh, well, it's not quite fulfilling my needs because it's not giving me the income I wanted, or it's not giving me the growth I wanted, or it's not as hands off as I wanted. So I think
Yeah.
that's a good point is, what's the lesson? Well, the lesson is buy only based on what your goals are, right?
Yeah. Have your kind of shopping list, like something I always do with like my clients now is like we kind of like define the shopping list of what is it you want, what is it you're looking for, because it's really easy to get distracted by something else. But it's that old adage of, if you walk into the supermarket with a shopping list, then that's what you're going to come out with. If you walk into a supermarket
Yeah,
with
and never go in hungry.
yeah, exactly. If you walk into a supermarket hungry and just with an idea in your mind, you're going to come out with things totally different. So it's no different when you're buying property, like, so we always make sure things are written down. The shopping list of what it is you're looking for, number of bedrooms, type of tenant it'll be good for, really basic, simple stuff like that to keep you focused on what it is you're actually going to end up buying.
I do it myself. I see something, oh yeah, that's nice. I'd like to buy that. That's quite cool. Or, or I could go and buy in Dubai, or could buy in, whatever it may be, or do a development. Let's split a house into flats. That would be good. But yeah, I always go back to sort of, okay, well, what am I trying to achieve? It's long term. It's not flashy stuff now. It's long term, sustainable stuff that in 20 years is going to be paid off and paying me an income. And
Mm.
it's true. You know, I did go into the supermarket hungry the other day after the gym, and I came out with 5 huge bags of popcorn. I never eat popcorn, but I was so hungry, and now I've just got 5 bags of popcorn in the house. But
And I think one of the ways that we keep things sort of simple in light, and if we're talking about simple, and especially like when you've got a lot of commitments as kind of like an expat with a day job and a time difference, or for me it was a young family, like I didn't have a lot of time. The way to keep something simple and to make growing a portfolio simple is to buy the same sort of thing over and over again, like repeat, tweak, improve, repeat, tweak, improve. And It might be a little bit difficult the first time, and you might do the first one and think, oh, I don't want to go do that again. But the second time, if you repeat the same thing, whilst yes, that can be boring, then it becomes simpler each time you repeat the same thing. So it can be exciting to look for something else and to do something different. But to do the boring thing, to repeat something that you've already done before, to leverage the lessons, I just find is a way that I've found to keep it simple, and to mean that it gets easier over time rather than getting more just either more difficult or just as difficult with each purchase. If you're doing something new all the time, it just you're taking the same level of challenge with each purchase, aren't you?
It is very true because although sort of the broad strokes are the same with property, there are differences within sort of licensing and different types of mortgages and this sort of stuff. So just a personal analogy, I don't know whether that's the right word, but I quite like to buy off-plan flats because it's easy on the cash flow,
Mhm.
and I know the process. You reserve it, bit of cash down, another 10% whenever, start doing the mortgage 4 or 5 months out, and it's all quite easy to manage. And I remember going down the process of buying a HMO, and it was fairly similar but different. It wasn't as easy on the cash flow because it was 35%, I think they wanted, plus the stamp duty up front. And then we were going through the mortgage process, and it's a different style of lender that would like to lend on a HMO. And then it gets through to, well, they've got the certificates, but the lenders don't like the certificates because the rooms aren't quite big enough, even though they've got the local blah blah blah, and it just sort of becomes, and if it's your first time doing it, it's a whole new experience. So I think that's a good point, is, but again, that is why doing the goal setting and figuring out what you want is so important, because
Mm,
if you do that properly and well, then you have that roadmap. Okay, these are the things I
yeah.
should buy based on my goals, and then you're not changing it and needing to sort of relearn a new purchase, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I love the way that you described that the new build off plan purchase is easy, because it is easy for you because you've done it so many times. But to lots of people who've maybe done a different style of purchase, that would sa- that would seem difficult. But it's exactly right. The more times we do something, the simpler it gets. Like, HMOs can be simple once you've done a few of them. But if you've not got that big idea of why you're doing this, then you're not going to want to repeat it again. You're just going to want to get through that one transaction, whatever it is, and be, and be done with it. I always see in my mind this like analogy of a conveyor belt, kind of like that. Where if you want to grow a property portfolio, you're going to do more than one transaction, because a portfolio is more than one property, right? So if we're doing anything that we're creating more than one of, we need a machine, and machines have conveyor belts, and conveyor belts have cogs and things like that. So I sort of see my business as like a virtual property machine. And there's different cogs, and there's a conveyor belt, and it moves slowly, and off the conveyor belt every so often drops an income generating asset. And if we're doing things similar to how we've done before, then the cogs are still doing the same job. You just need to manage it and maybe oil it a bit here or tighten it a bit there. And occasionally I will put an extra cog in, right, for a new thing, but it's one cog being added to the whole machine, not like taking everything out and redesigning it and putting it back. So I just find having that analogy of like that machine helps me make decisions about what new things I'm going to do versus I'm not going to do. Like, how many cogs do I really need to change? And kind of like, when we get to the end of one transaction, if there's kind of like been problems or challenges, it's like, right, well, where are the problems in the cogs? Like, what cogs do we need to tweak or change? Or is it just one of those things, right? Sometimes things just don't work out, and there's nothing that you need to change. Don't throw the
Mm.
baby out with the bathwater, kind of thing. Sometimes things just don't work out. If you're going to walk everywhere, at some point you're going to trip and fall. It's just what happens. You can't then say, right, well, I'm not going to walk anymore. You just got to be like, okay, cool, well, that's happened, let's just get up and still carry on. Because if it's happened once, it's likely not going to happen again if it was just one of those type of things.
Yeah, that's very true. Usually it's a pretty smooth process, but every now and then you do get one that sort of tips you up a little bit. So talking about the conveyor belt, then how do you, when you're looking for new things being properties to put into the start of your conveyor belt, how do you go about sort of sourcing and finding properties nowadays? Have you got a set area and type of property you look at? Have you got a set process you follow for analyzing if something is going to fit in with what you're doing? How do you fill the conveyor belt?
Yeah, so any sort of like one time I'm focusing on a particular area, because I know that there's an opportunity there or a reason, a reason why I want to be there. I think one of the hardest things in property, especially for expats, is that property works anywhere, anywhere and everywhere. Uh, uh, Across the UK, there's probably a landlord on most streets in the UK. Some landlords will own £1 million houses on like very fancy streets in London, and some landlords own one-bed flats in blocks and everything in between. Some landlords only buy garages, right? But there are property works absolutely everywhere. And I think one of the hardest decisions for an expat is choosing where specifically to focus. And really narrowing down your scope and focusing on one area, because when you're overseas, you could buy anywhere and you can get like distracted by like, where's the best area, where's the best area, where's the best, and this is what a lot of people talk about, where's the best area. And I think there's no one best area. You've kind of got to choose an area and then make it small enough that it's manageable, right? When I speak to some people and they'll say, oh yeah, I buy in Leeds or I buy in Manchester, I'm like, these are like hundreds of square kilometres, right? Manchester's, for example, is 10 local authorities. It's the size of Singapore. Like, just saying Manchester, like, if you're one person with 24 hours in the day, how even are you going to like handle that? It's just too much. So I'll always have like an area where I'm focused on, like a pretty tight area really, because I'm all about simple and I'm all about keeping things small and tight. So I'll have like, 1 3 to 5 mile area where I want to focus on. So straight away, you're just throwing out a lot of noise. Like, even if you're saying I want to invest in Leeds or Sheffield or Huddersfield, there's still big areas, right? So I like to be focused on one particular area and then do my search in those areas for properties that meet my criteria. But I like to move into viewing really quite quickly. I find that there's so many apps and tools and systems available online that it's actually, again, when we're thousands of miles away, quite easy to get stuck behind our laptops, right? And think that we're making progress by doing research and trawling Rightmove and looking at other systems and data and things like that. We actually make the most progress when we can get out there and start viewing and actually start seeing properties and having the conversations with the people who are selling the houses. So whether you're doing that through a sourcing agent or whether you're doing that through yourself, if you decide to set up your own routines for being able to do that, I find that that's really important. And if you're being consistent about that and doing that consistently, yes, you might be looking at properties that are, on the market, but if you're viewing every week or every couple of weeks and doing that consistently, then you're more likely to come across other properties as well. It could be that your estate agent is whilst you're asking them about viewing one property, it could be that they've got another one that's just come back on the market that's next door, and they're like, whilst you're viewing this one that you've asked about, do you want to view the one next door? But that sort of thing is never going to happen if you're just trolling Rightmove, if you're looking at the apps and all that kind of thing. That's going to happen when you're on the phone doing the viewings or when you're speaking to your sourcing agent. It doesn't matter how you're doing it, but I find you need to choose what's your way for being able to how's your cog for shortlisting and viewing properties going to work? Is it going to be a sourcing agent doing that for you regularly, or are you going to set up your own routines and habits for doing that, and then moving into that stage of the process, which can feel uncomfortable and awkward and difficult because it's getting real, but then that's how then we can move forward. I find, and I feel this because for a long time I stayed behind the computer, looking at Rightmove all the time, and just looking at the emails that come through with deals on. And guess what? In those times, that's when you're not buying. You start buying when you're actually having the real conversations and actually doing the viewings stuff and starting to feel uncomfortable.
And you learn as well. I mean, even if you don't actually buy stuff, if you do enough viewings and engage with enough people, you'll start. I'm a big believer if you sort of immerse yourself in something enough, you will learn about it. I went when I was a young boy, I went to Ukraine with a friend of mine who was Ukrainian, and we went to a part of Ukraine for 3 weeks where they didn't speak any English. And by the end of the 3 weeks, I was quite good at conversing in Ukrainian because I had no choice because I was immersed in it. And I think it's the same, yeah, with property, with anything. If you actually immerse yourself in it, you start learning the lingo and how things are done. And,
Yeah.
um,
And
you've actually got to go out and do the thing as opposed to talking about it.
yeah. And it sounds scary because I think I avoided this for a long time, I realise now, because it felt like that would be really difficult and quite heavy and take a lot of time, and I was quite time short, and then you come up with a time difference and created all these reasons why I just couldn't do it. But when I like figured out how to do viewings and like put in place a system for myself, actually became quite simple, and I realised you don't need to be on Rightmove all the time, right? You can create a process that actually is quite streamlined and doesn't take lots of time. And the more that you do it, the simpler it gets. And for me, it sounds a bit grand, but figuring out how to view properties without flying back to the UK and how to be able to do that regularly and simply and easily, that actually opened my eyes in a way and allowed me to see how everything else would and could be possible. And it's kind of like I found myself talking to a lot of people about that and how, how I did that. Um, and it's why I ended up recording like a short course on it, actually, because I'd realised that I would make mistakes and I would miss things out. And I spoke to one lady one day by the pool in Abu Dhabi, and the next day or something, she was flying back to the UK for this weekend because she had one or two properties that she wanted to view, and she had to go and see them because she didn't know another way. So she was flying back. She had a daughter in childcare. She was doing a red eye there and a red eye back, and I was like, and she was like, so, how do you do it? And I briefly ran her through the process, and she was like, oh my God, I wish I'd met you like 2 weeks ago. You just saved me thousands of pounds. Like, I've organised the hire cars, the hotel, the flights, the childcare. And I was just like, oh my gosh. So that was like what sort of triggered me to be like,
Yeah.
just got to record this, because it's for somebody who wants to, like, she was prepared to get on a flight and fly back at great expense. And we just don't need to if we don't want to.
How do you do it then? Or is that a trade secret?
Well, that's why we go to the workshops and I talk about it. I miss so many things, but you can get, you can. One thing that I found a lot of people would do is get estate agents to do viewings for you and like send you videos. And I just find that that's not really kind of helpful. You need to find a way to be able to get viewings done, get somebody to do viewings for you, and do it so that you get all the information that you need. Like, I've spoken to people who will say, oh, I got my dad to do it for me. And I'm like, great. And what did your dad say? And they'll be like, oh, well, he said that he wouldn't live there. And we're like, yeah, but he doesn't need to live there. That's not the information that you need.
But also, is your dad a property investor? Is
Yes.
your dad a property professional? No, he's
Yeah,
not, so he's probably looking at, I wouldn't live there. He's looking at it through a head lens, a heart lens, isn't he? Rather than a head lens,
exactly.
You should be asking your dad, did the figures stack up? What's the yield? Is there any damage I need to be concerned about? But unless he knows what he's looking for, he's going to give you wrong information.
Yeah, well, for the viewing stage, really, you need somebody. What we can't do as expats or nomads is we can't show up on the ground, right? We can do lots of other stuff in the background, the yield and things like that, but we can't show up and do the viewing. And if you're going to buy a property, someone needs to show up and do the viewing to allow you to make the offer. Some of the more technical stuff about what's wrong with the building, you can do that. Again, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be qualified to look at a building structurally. That's what a surveyor comes in to do. But we don't need to do
No,
that until
of
the
course.
offer's been accepted, right? Sorry.
No, I'm saying I wouldn't know how to do it either.
Exactly. So, as property investors, we're not surveyors, so we need to go off, in terms of really knowing some of the building works that needs to get done. You're not going to know that until a surveyor comes out, and you can't get a surveyor out until your offer's been accepted. So what we need to do is we know yields, we can calculate things like that. What we need is someone to show up to really give the buyer assurance that we're a normal person. We can show up and,
Yeah.
view the property and that our offer is valid. So you need somebody who can show up and view the property for you, take independent and neutral pictures, because, an estate agent, their customer, if you like, is the vendor, right? They're being paid by the vendor. So the vendor is
Yeah.
their customer. Yes, they're kind and helpful and friendly people, but from a supplier customer perspective, the customer is the person who pays, the vendor is paying. So we as investors need to be able to get independent pictures of those corners that aren't in the pictures that we get sent by the estate agent and things like that. So we need to be able to get those pictures and get the information about the property and what defects that are there, so we can validate what the offer needs to be to work by our criteria. And if it gets accepted, then we can get a structural surveyor to come out. So we need someone to view as if we would if we were there, but obviously without our kind of flight costs.
So I have a slightly different approach. I guess same, but different is sort of try and build relationships with managing agents in cities that I'm interested in. And, certainly if I've bought property off them before, I would always say to an agent when I'm approaching them, this is the type of thing I'm looking for. This is my plan to buy this many properties over this many years. I'd like to find someone in the area to do that with. So you sort of, bit of a carrot, give them a bit of incentive to sort of do well the first time round. And then if ever I'm looking in a new area, I will go to my people that I have a relationship with, and I'll say, look, that's where I got the HMO from, because it was still being built, it was off market, and I went to this guy that's an agent, and I said, this is what I'm looking for, similar to the sort of thing you helped me with before. Have you got anything that's coming up on the market? And I guess he was motivated to sell HMO because he said, it's not what you're looking for, but I have got this off market. So I think, yeah, for me, it's a lot of it is about relationships, and I'll
Mm.
get the agents to go and have a look at things for me. And maybe that might be a bit biased, but yeah, I find that works for me.
And I love it, Colin. I do think, and just on that, there's no one right way to do this. There's so many different options and ways to get things done, and I love that that's the way that you do it, and that works for you, and you accept the risks of that. Just because it isn't the way that I would do it doesn't make it right or doesn't make it wrong. You've got a solid kind of like process and a solid way for making that cog work for you in a way that makes you feel comfortable. So I just, I love hearing about the different ways that people do things, and I see it all the time in people that I work with. There's no one right way. We just have to be comfortable with our machine, and when we know how we're going to do a certain cog, then suddenly that cog feels lighter and simpler and easier for us, right? Because we know how we do that thing.
100%. Yeah, there is no one right way to do it, and that right way to do it. And that's why I think I'm always, skeptical of sort of property gurus, which is, yeah, this is the one and only way to do it. Buy my course and I'll show you exactly how to do it. I mean, it works for them. It might work for you. It might not work for you. A different approach might work for you. And there's people doing all sorts of property strategy, let to let, BRR, HMOs, refurbs, new build off plan, whatever it might be, and it's working for them, But that's why you've got to go back to the goals to
Yeah,
figure out what might work for you.
yeah.
Say there's someone listening and they think, you know what, that sounds nice. I'd like to be traveling the world with my family, slow traveling or fast traveling. What sort of, and they haven't bought any property, but they want to get started, what
Hmm.
would you say to them, as someone that wants to get started? What would your pearls of wisdom be over the past 16 years of doing it? You say,
Yeah.
okay, if I was starting again and I wanted to do what I'm doing, but sooner, these are some of the things I'd consider.
I think that being an expat is a really great way to or it simplifies if you want to move into full-time travel in the future, because um when you're an expat, you get to, or when you live and work overseas, should we say, if you've got the travel bug and you like traveling, then different places become places that you can hop to for a weekend. When you live in the Middle East, you can go to India for a weekend, you can go to Sri Lanka for a weekend, you can go to Jordan or Oman, or go for a desert camping trip, or for a weekend, like things that just seem really crazily exotic, or like with huge time differences if you're in the UK. So I'm so grateful that we moved overseas first, because it did satisfy that kind of like travel bug for us, but it also allowed me to kind of like find a way to be able to work online. Like, it sounds crazy to say that, our property business is an online business, especially in a world where lots of people are looking for ways to earn money online, all sorts of weird and wonderful sort of ways. You wouldn't naturally think that property is an online business. But if you're living overseas, and, for whatever reason, because you're a trading spouse or because you've taken a job overseas and you want to create a property income stream, then you're forced to do it in a way like I did, and then once you've done that, you've got an online business that's a property business. And then whenever you're ready, you can then just, our property business hasn't really changed at all from us being an expat to being nomads. We still run the property business in the same way because we're still overseas. We just, the background's different. It changes more
Yeah.
frequently than it used to when we were in Abu Dhabi, sort of thing. So for anyone who has got that kind of like travel inclination, if you become an expat before you become a nomad, then that's a really great stepping stone. Or if you're an expat and you want to become more nomadic, then set up your property business whilst you're an expat, because then your property business won't change as you move and travel, because you're running it from thousands of miles anyway.
Like we were just saying before, there's plenty of ways to put it together, right? And that's the whole point, is that I think, though, if you are starting out and you're trying to get your head around it, it is a big confusing thing to do, isn't it? So what did you, there you go. This is the first question I actually wrote down when we first started talking is, why property in the very first instance? Why did you buy your first one? Was it something that as a Brit, it's ingrained in you and we all want to buy property, or was there something, an aha moment where you were sort of like, okay, I think property is the way to go? And then how did you start? How did you buy your first one? You know, were you mentored? Did you do all the research yourself? What was that process like?
Gosh, right, going back there. Okay, so um, I did everything I thought you were meant to do, right? Went to school, went to college, went to university, got an education, got a career. The career was exactly what I was just so really, like I say, I was involved in like process design and process management and things like that. And I got what on paper was the most amazing job. And a few years in, I was just like, I'm not sure I'm on the right path. Like I'm on this career path now where, there would be promotions and things like that. And I just felt really constrained, and that it wasn't actually the life that I really felt, like in my heart that I wanted. I didn't really feel fulfilled. I didn't feel it was purposeful. But on paper, I had like this most amazing job. And I had a bit of a quarter life crisis, for want of a better phrase, to be honest. And that,
Oh, I had one of those.
did you? And I kind of felt
Yeah.
so stupid for it as well, because it was silly. Like I had this amazing job. Like, me and my boyfriend then had bought a house, had a company car. Like, it was just on paper, it was all amazing. But I'd cry on my way to work every morning, and I couldn't figure out why. And I thought everyone did that. Like it was just, I don't know. It just wasn't a very happy time, but on paper it should have been. So that was kind of like mid 20s. And I kind of like, I think I read Rich Dad Poor Dad basically, and I realized, I just hadn't
Yeah.
realized, it sounds silly, but I just hadn't realized that there was other ways to earn an income, there was other ways to live. And I know it's a cliche, right? It's a changing point for a lot of people, but it really did make me think about setting up my life in a different way. So I resigned this amazing job whilst crying. Obviously, I did a lot of stuff whilst crying back then, and
Yeah.
and thought, I didn't need to find another way to earn an income in life. So I contracted for a while. Did kind of like contract like roles in my field, and looked for different businesses. At one point, we were setting up coffee shops and we were setting up an interior design business. And again, it just wasn't really feeling it. So I was constantly on the lookout for something, some sort of business I had in mind, some sort of business that I could actually run and scale from anywhere, that would just give me that ability. So I guess that kind of like travel bug has always been in me a bit. I just hadn't wanted to tie myself to one location, which coffee shops clearly do. So I don't know why I went down that road, but anyway,
Yeah.
that's why we didn't end up working out. And then I think one day I just came across, I don't exactly know how or why. Maybe someone mentioned it to me, but I stumbled across some sort of like property training and just started to look at property as a business. And just like suddenly the light went on. Like we'd been brought up in rented accommodation as a single parent family, low income single parent family, and we would have stayed in our rented accommodation for decades if our landlords would have kept us. But we got evicted twice as in my childhood, because basically landlords wanted to cash out or sell up or do something, and that was hugely impactful on me as like a teenager, like having to move. And because we were on low income, we were on benefits, we'd then be back at the letting agents. And I remember one day we walked in the door of one letting agent, and when they found out we were on benefits and my mum was on benefits, they basically showed us the door. And I was just like, as a young
Yeah.
teen, like, I don't get this. Like, it's still GBP, it's still a currency. Why is our money not good enough just because we get it for the government? And I just couldn't understand it. So when I kind of like had this light switch turned on that property could be a business, I was like, yeah, I know there are families out, and we would never have bought either. We just wouldn't have bought. It didn't fit. All we wanted was a home that we could live in without being worried that we'd have to leave. So I kind of thought, family homes, like there are lots of people who just want a family home to rent for a generation, basically.
Yeah.
So that just made me kind of like realize that was a business that I could get into, because financially it was viable and sustainable, but also I had this really heart-led way in it that I could create houses for people like me, for people like our family when we were younger. And I think if you're going to get into a business, any business, whether it's making clothes or selling a product, like you've got to have an actual, all these businesses work, but we get up every day and do it again if we've actually got a heartfelt reason for it as well. So that was why I kind of like realised that property would kind of like work for us, and that's kind of like what set me on the road to kind of like learn about it. I did work with a mentor. I kind of like know what I'm like, and if I want to achieve a goal, if I want to achieve a physical goal, then I'll take on a personal trainer or something like that. So when it was like properties, like yes, I can do a certain amount of learning myself, but I also know that like in my mind it can be my wiring that can kind of like get in the way. If I've not done something before, I'd much prefer to learn from somebody who's done it, so that I can like learn how their brain's wired to change my brain wiring. So yeah, I took on a mentor to help me for the first few purchases. And I suppose one of my mistakes, right, we're just going back to one of your earlier questions, is when we moved overseas and I was scaling from overseas, I was repeating the process that we'd done before. I didn't think to try and find a mentor who'd actually bought from overseas and was aware of all those kind of things. I hadn't connected those dots really. So yeah, learned the hard and the long way. That for me as a person, I learn better, especially when I'm doing something new and especially when I'm short on time. But if I can learn from somebody and just have their brain downloading into me and my business and my goals.
Yeah, well, I think that's the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 rules to become an expert. It is if you sort of trial and error on your own, but I think you can bypass that a little bit by working with, getting a mentor, whatever that's in, as you say. Or, a mentor doesn't have to be a person, it can be a book, because that is a person's experience in written form or a video or this podcast. Right, I think we've got to leave it there.
Right, well, have a fantastic rest of your day and a great weekend. See you, Callum.
See you, Julie. Take care.